On the morning of May 11th, 1995, in a convention hall in Los Angeles, the CEO of a video game company stood on stage in front of an audience of retailers, developers, and reporters, and announced that his company's new console was already sitting on store shelves that very day, 4 months ahead of the release date his own company had promised the industry. What almost nobody in that room knew was that the man making the announcement had fought against it for weeks. He had argued it was too soon, that there were not enough games ready, that the retailers who had not been warned would feel betrayed. He was overruled anyway, and now he had to stand there and sell a decision he did not believe in. Within minutes, a rival executive walked up to a different microphone and undercut the price of that console by $100, live in front of the same room. It would turn out to be one of the most consequential few minutes in the history of the video game industry. And the strange part is that the company on that stage was not some struggling also-ran. 3 years earlier, it had done something almost nobody thought was possible. It had taken 65% of the American home console market away from Nintendo, the company that had defined the entire category. This is the story of how that company built one of the most aggressive, fastest-moving playbooks in the history of consumer electronics, used it to humiliate a giant, and then, without ever really changing that playbook, used the exact same instincts to blindside its own partners until there was nobody left standing beside it. The company had started life decades earlier and half a world away from that stage. It was founded in June of 1960 in Japan, built out of the wreckage of an earlier jukebox and coin-operated amusement business, and 5 years later, it merged with an American entrepreneur's arcade import company to form a single business focused on the arcade machines that were starting to appear in bars and amusement arcades across Japan and the United States. It changed hands more than once in its early years, sold at the end of the 60s to a large American media conglomerate, before a group led by 2 of its own executives bought the company back out in 1984 with financial backing from a Japanese investment firm. One of those 2 men became the new chief executive, and under him, the company pushed into the home console market it had mostly watched from the sidelines, releasing a machine in Japan in 1985 that reached North America the following year. It sold modestly. It was not the console that would define the company. But in 1986, the company opened a dedicated American subsidiary, its own outpost on the other side of the Pacific, with its own leadership, its own budget, and eventually, its own very different instincts about how to fight for shelf space in a market that a single Japanese company, Nintendo, controlled almost completely. The turning point for that American subsidiary arrived in 1990 when it hired a new president who had spent the previous 2 decades reviving struggling consumer brands, first at a toy company where he had rebuilt a fading doll line into a cultural phenomenon, then at a smaller company he had pulled back from the edge of bankruptcy. He arrived with a simple 4-point plan, and the boldest part of it was a decision about a single piece of plastic. The console at the time shipped bundled with a serviceable but forgettable game. He tore it out and replaced it with something the company's own Japanese design team had built almost as a side project, a fast, brightly colored platform game starring a blue hedgehog. Every console sold now came with that game for free, and the game itself became the console's entire personality. Around it, the American team built one of the most openly aggressive advertising campaigns consumer electronics had ever seen. Comparison ads that mocked the market leader by name, a marketing line that told shoppers outright that this console did what the other one would not. It worked far better than almost anyone expected. By the holiday season of 1991, the company was outselling Nintendo's own console nearly 2-to-1 in the United States, and by January of 1992, it held 65% of the American 16-bit console market. The first time in 7 years that Nintendo was not the leader in its own category. A Japanese hardware company with a modest arcade pedigree had, through pure marketing nerve and one bundling decision, become the biggest video game brand in America. That same instinct, the willingness to move first and move fast, to announce before you were fully ready and dare the market to catch up, had won the console war almost by itself. But underneath the marketing triumph, a structural problem was quietly building. The American subsidiary and the Japanese headquarters increasingly disagreed about strategy, and headquarters in Japan still held the final word on the biggest decisions, even ones about the American market that its own American president understood far better than anyone in Tokyo. In November of 1994, the company launched a new, more powerful console in Japan, a machine built to compete with an entirely new rival that was about to enter the industry for the first time. A consumer electronics giant with no console pedigree at all, but with deep pockets and no history of losing a launch. The American president wanted to bring the new console to the United States carefully, with enough games ready and enough advance notice for the retail chains that had helped make the previous console a hit. He did not get his way. Somewhere above him, a decision was made to move fast again. The same instinct that had worked so well 4 years earlier applied now to something far less forgiving than a television commercial: the actual physical distribution of a console to actual physical stores. That decision landed on the stage in Los Angeles on May 11, 1995. The console, priced at $399, was announced as available for purchase that same day, with roughly 30,000 units already shipped to a handful of retail chains that had been read in ahead of time. Two of the country's largest electronics and toy retailers had not been told anything in advance, and one of them responded by refusing to stock the console or its games at all, a boycott by a major American retail chain against a product it felt had been sprung on it without warning. Then, before the audience had even finished absorbing the announcement, an executive from the new rival company walked to a microphone and announced his own machine's price, $299, $100 cheaper, time to land in the same room, on the same day, as the exact worst possible moment for it to happen. The strategy that had once meant surprising Nintendo with a bold ad campaign now meant surprising your own retail partners with a product they were not ready to sell at a price the market immediately made look overpriced. The company had not changed its instincts at all. It had simply pointed the same gun in a new direction, and this time, it was aimed at the people who were supposed to be selling the product for them. The damage did not stay contained to that one afternoon. Retailers who felt burned by the surprise launch were slower to support the console going forward, and the games needed to make it worth owning arrived too thin and too late. The company's American president, the same man who had built the Sonic strategy and had fought against the early launch from the start, resigned in 1996. His successor arrived to find, in his own words, a console lineup that simply was not selling, and within a year, that new president stood in front of another industry audience and said plainly that this console was not the company's future, effectively ending its American life 2 full years before its successor would even exist. If you think a company can fix a structural problem just by replacing the person at the top, stay with me, because the next mistake came from exactly the divide that pushed the first one through. When it came time to design that successor console, the American and Japanese divisions could not agree on which core hardware to build around. One side preferring a chip with stronger ties to game developers outside Japan, the other preferring a chip that made it easier to convert the company's own arcade games into home versions. Neither side got everything it wanted, because by then, the company genuinely could not afford to build 2 separate machines for 2 separate continents, and the compromised chip selected under financial pressure became a permanent scar on how much the new console could actually do compared to what was being planned by competitors circling the same launch window. The next console launched in Japan in November of 1998 and in the United States on September 9, 1999, priced at $199, backed by a marketing campaign built entirely around that launch date. It worked, briefly and spectacularly. The company reported nearly $100 million in combined hardware and software sales in the United States on that single launch day alone, one of the strongest openings any console had ever had. But 6 months later, in March of 2000, the industry's dominant rival launched its own next-generation console, a machine with a far larger installed base of trust behind it, and the momentum reversed almost as fast as it had arrived. The company had set a goal of 5 million American console sales for the year 2000. It sold roughly 3 million. The financial losses that had already begun in 1998 kept compounding, tens of billions of yen in the red year after year, and on January 31st, 2001, the company announced that it was leaving the console hardware business entirely, ending production of its own machines within 2 months, and becoming, for the first time in its history, a company that made games for other people's consoles instead of its own. When the dust settled, the American console market that this same company had once controlled at 65% had reshaped itself completely. The new leader held half of it, Nintendo held about a third, and the company that had started this whole story on a stage in Los Angeles was left holding roughly 15% in third place of a race it had once been winning outright. The man who became the company's president just before that final decision was not one of the executives who had pushed for the surprise launches or the rushed chip compromise. He was an older investor and chairman of the Japanese firm that had helped fund the original 1984 buyout, and by the time he took the president's title in May of 2000, he had already quietly put more than $40 million of his own personal fortune into the company to keep its last console alive through development. He was dying of heart failure by the time the hardware business finally closed. In his final weeks, he made one more decision, and it was the opposite of everything that had gone wrong in the boardrooms years earlier. He forgave every debt the company owed him personally, and on top of that, he gave the company $695 million of his own stock outright, with no strings attached, simply so the business could survive as a smaller, software-only company instead of collapsing completely. He died on March 16, 2001, less than 3 weeks after the console business he had helped keep alive finally shut its doors for good. The same company whose leadership had spent a decade making bold, fast, unilateral moves without bringing its partners along was saved, in the end, by one man's slow, deliberate, and entirely selfless final act. It is tempting to say this company simply lost a console war. It could not win against bigger rivals, but that misses what actually happened. The same instinct, bold, fast, willing to surprise the market before anyone was ready, built the empire in 1991 and broke it in 1995. The difference was never the speed itself. It was who that speed was aimed at. When the target was a rival's advertising campaign, moving first and moving loud won new customers and cost nothing but nerve. When the target quietly shifted to the company's own retail partners and its own internal chip decisions, that same instinct meant blindsiding the very people whose trust the whole business depended on. A structure that let headquarters overrule the one executive who understood the American market best, the same executive who had built the winning playbook in the first place, meant the boldness kept firing long after the person who knew how to aim it had lost the authority to say no. The company that had once beaten a giant by refusing to play it safe ended up beaten by refusing to ever learn when playing it safe was the only move left. It survives today, making the same games under other companies' hardware, its most famous character still running at full speed, decades after the company that created him stopped being able to keep up with its own instincts. If you want more stories about companies that beat their biggest rival and then somehow lost to themselves, this channel is built entirely around that pattern, one company at a time. Subscribe if you want the next one when it lands. And down in the comments, tell me honestly, did you ever own one of that company's consoles growing up? And if so, which one? And did it work out better for you than it did for them? I read every comment, and this is Toppled Empires.